Hey there, I'm Matt Sanchez. I'm an account executive for Zerto. Thank you guys for coming in and listening. Pleased to have Steve Blow over here from Zerto as well to talk about migration and how Zerto is going to support you guys with your migration. We also have our fine folks from Aaron's. We have Tommy Meek as well as Michael Cushman. They're going to talk about their use case and how they were able to move their production data center from one point to another with Zerto. So with that, I will turn it over to Steve and go from there.
Cheers, Matt. Hi guys, so yeah, we're here to talk about migrations, where Zerto fits in that, and I guess traditionally what you've done with migrations in the past, what statistics we're seeing in the marketplace today. So we'll touch on the statistics first, then we'll look at some traditional solutions, how people have typically done migrations, and then we'll talk about Zerto and how we implement that, and then as Matt said, Aaron's are going to talk about a recent project they did utilizing Zerto to perform that migration. So firstly, has anyone in the process of a migration done a migration recently? Cool. Is anyone using Zerto for that? Cool, few of you. Anyone considering Zerto? Cool. Cool. So hopefully we're going to give you some insight today of how Zerto can ultimately help you with those migration goals. So if we look at some statistics first, these I've got from an Expedian-based data migration survey they did. And from this, they said majority of projects are consisting of 3 or more systems. If you think a system could have multiple dependencies, could get fairly complex fairly quickly. So the majority of those migrations are going to be or have some complexity involved. I guess that leads me on to the next one, which is 52% had effective data scoping. Any migration needs effective data scoping. If you don't understand the dependencies of the applications you're moving and ultimately your environments, you're going to have trouble, and ultimately your migration isn't going to be a success. Now, not everyone's capable of understanding and ultimately having the resource to find out that and perform that scoping. We've got numerous partners. I know Aaron's involved a partner in some of the work that they did. IBM Cloud Migration Factory, for example, is a partner that we work very closely with. They actually default on using Zerto for virtual workloads nowadays, and they can help with that scoping. Obviously, that element is something that we rely on partners to support us with. 64% of projects use manual scripting. So this might surprise you. It's obviously a fairly large majority. But if you think of an application, particularly enterprise applications, every deployment, every customer's use of it is going to be slightly different. It's going to be bespoke. There might not be necessarily tools available to perform this, or historically there might not have been tools in how to manage that. And so customers have felt more comfortable scripting it so that it's bespoke to their environment, which sounds great, but actually it introduces a complexity, introduces reliance on individuals, and therefore ultimately it introduces risk. Hopefully we're going to talk a bit about how you can actually avoid that scenario. 46% of migrations ultimately are not well forecasted, or rather are well forecasted. So again, forecasting migrations can be a big challenge. If you look at migrations and what the main aspect of any migration is, it's the data move. How big's the data set that you're moving? How are you moving it? Is it over the wire? What's the bandwidth available? There's a fair few variables in that, and therefore forecasting the migration can be fairly challenging. If one of those variables change, that can drastically change your migration schedule, and that's why we're seeing a low figure here. Equally, when you're looking to manage and govern this, the same variables apply. How do you manage scenarios where those variables change and ultimately your scope and your timelines are stretched? How do you manage that? And that becomes very challenging. And again, that's why we're seeing that only 43% of these are well managed and governed. Because of this, a lot of people use a phased approach on the migration strategy. I think Aaron's going to talk a bit about how they did that. But there's a reason for this. It means if you do have that slip on timelines because of variables changing and things like that, it's only going to affect that one phase. It's easier to manage from your perspective to recover the timelines and ultimately understand what went wrong and fix that in the next time you try it. 36% of projects kept to budget. Again, the big thing here is if you have issues in your migrations and it changes the timescales, it's going to change the cost. It's inevitable. So you're ultimately making hypotheses and assumptions around how long things are going to take, and therefore, there can be slip in that, which ultimately can cost you more. That's why obviously 36%. It's a slightly lower number. People usually budget in a little bit more for these things, but it's something that also should be considered when you're looking at migrations. 46% of projects delivered on time. Hopefully the last points I've just covered are going to give you some idea as to why that is. And then 69% of projects actually considered successful, which I actually think is quite a low number. And that's because traditional methods and how people have done this traditionally can become quite complex. There's a fair amount of risk involved, and sometimes timelines can't be met, at which point they wouldn't be considered successful. So if we look at traditional migration challenges, one of the big ones is knowledge. So what do I mean about that? So employee turnover. Most customers still have some form of legacy applications. Maybe the staff members that deployed that, who understood that application, no longer with the company. Maybe there wasn't a knowledge handover on that. How do you manage those scenarios? It comes back to the whole scoping piece. If you don't understand your applications, it can be very hard to perform certain migration or utilize certain migration types to perform that migration. Equally, shadow IT. This is a big talking point in the industry right now, where you've got customers who have staff members going out rogue and ultimately deploying stopgap solutions in public clouds using company credit cards or something like that, out of the control of central IT. How do you manage that? How do you understand how that integrates with your existing IT infrastructure? And then also, how do you ultimately bring it back under your control in what you would consider a supportable environment? And then application support. Is the application still supported? Do you have support from the vendor on that application? Again, that's going to impact how you move your applications. Technology lock-in's a big one as well. What platform are you on today? What are you looking to go to? Historically, again, technology lock-in has prevented customers choosing the target environment that suits them best. They might stay with a hardware vendor, which means that they have to deploy a certain infrastructure on the target side in order to enable the migration. You could be using the same hypervisor. It means that you can't potentially look at elsewhere and see actually what suits you best as a business. Rather, you're looking at, well, based on lock-in, where am I going best? So really one of the challenges is, how do you remove that? How do you remove that lock-in, which can be expensive as well, and ultimately bring everything back in to where it suits you best. Hybrid IT is something that everyone's talking about right now, and being able to move your workloads and place them where suits you best is ultimately the end goal of hybrid cloud, right? It's why it exists. It's where do I find the best cost efficiencies, and so being able to do that is one of the big challenges involved. Cloud adoption. So I touched a bit on that there. Obviously, again, everyone's at least talking about utilizing the cloud. Might not fit everyone from a compliance perspective, but they're talking about it. I like to think of public cloud as like a game of Tetris. There's multiple offerings within every public cloud, and they can all go together in various different ways. And I guess the key thing is, when you're looking at that, what's the best route to adopt that strategy? I often think that the best route is to get your data and your applications into the cloud and then re-architect them, because it removes the complexity. If you're re-architecting them at the same time as you're migrating into the cloud, you're adding complexity. You potentially need to do a lot at the same time, and how do you manage that becomes more difficult to manage. Another big thing is mobility. What happens if you change your strategy? What happens if you've got elements in another public cloud from a shadow IT deployment or something like that? How do you manage the mobility between these platforms? Again, typically that's been a challenge that traditionally hasn't had an answer without manual involvement. And then exit strategy. Any CFO is going to want to understand what the risk is involved with deploying on a public cloud, and how ultimately they can reverse that decision down the line if necessary. And then time constraints. This is probably the biggest enemy of migrations. You know, if we looked at the stats that I covered on the last slide, a lot of them involved around how long the migration took, and that directly links to ultimately how much the migration costs. And so this is the big one. What's the resources involved? What are the overheads on personnel? How does that impact your daily running? You know, because quite often this is a task that has to have professional services brought in just because the resource count doesn't exist. Downtime, really, you know, this is about minimizing your downtime. Any business is going to want to stay up and running, keep the lights on for as long as possible. So it's about how do we move this environment without major impact on revenues and other business concerns. And then compliance, you know, everyone's talking about GDPR in Europe at the moment. It's things that need to be considered. What are you doing with your data? How are you moving it, etc. So if we look at traditional migration solutions, just going to touch on a few of these. It's not going to be all of them. But number one, manual data move. So you are building a new greenfield environment and moving the data out of the existing applications into new deployments of the same applications. So pros of this is you're doing fresh OS installs, you're doing application updates as part of the migration, but there's a lot of cons to this at the same time. Knowledge is essential if you're doing this. You need to know the ins and outs of every single one of your applications in order to do this, because you're just moving the data set. You don't have a capability in this scenario to lift and shift as is. Application support, again, is key. You know, if you don't have that knowledge, do you have the vendor to support you there? Quite often with legacy applications, that's not the case. Either they don't support them anymore, or maybe the vendor doesn't even exist anymore. When you're doing this, it is absolutely resource intensive. You've got staff members involved on a day-to-day basis with this, performing the migration, deploying the new environment, and it can therefore have a big impact on your IT teams. Which is usually why external PS has to be brought in for this scenario. And then downtime. As soon as you are ready to move the data, you're going to have to stop access to the production application. As soon as you've done that, the application is down. It's as long as it takes to copy the data over, reconfigure it, get it all in the environment. How do you manage that? It can get very complex. What happens if something goes wrong? You have to roll it all back. And that's why this is expensive, A, because of the resource involved, but B, because of the impact on the business itself. Time really is the enemy here, and time costs money in migrations. If we look at a storage level move, so this covers a number of scenarios. So it could be a storage replication, using storage replication at the storage hardware layer, or potentially utilizing a hypervisor tool to perform that storage migration, like storage vMotion, for example. Obviously, this gives you the ability to move entire LUNs or VMs whole. You don't need to understand, therefore, necessarily exactly the inner workings of the application on each VM. You still absolutely need to understand the dependencies so that you can move them together. But the knowledge is less important when you're going down into the detail of how it's configured within the VM. Some of these scenarios can actually allow you to move the production workloads online. Storage vMotion in VMware, for example. You can do it without downtime. But there's cons to that as well. It's very difficult to manage. Again, if we're talking about storage vMotion, when you're migrating your workloads, yes, you can do them online. You can move all of the VMs that make up a single application using storage vMotion. But those VMs are going to be different sizes. They're all going to arrive on the target side at different times. So at one point, you're going to be running with your applications split across the data centers. What's the impact if the link goes down? Because of that, are you really going to do it online? And that's really why I've got downtime here. Most customers, even when they're doing this, are going to be making the applications unavailable to end users during this period, because there's a risk associated, as I said, where you've effectively got a split brain. Again, with the greater risk element, if you're doing a storage vMotion, for example, you've started the migration. If the line goes down or there's connectivity issues during that migration, it doesn't effectively pause where you were at. You have to start again from scratch. So you're going then back and reinitiating that move. If you're talking a large data set, that can take a long period of time and effectively push your timescales out further. It may even mean that the migration window that you've got for that move, you can't utilize and you've got to reorganize another one down the line. And that can have a fairly large impact on meeting your timeframes that you've committed to for this migration. Lock-in, again, if you're doing it storage replication, you're locked in at the hardware layer. You need the same or similar device on the target side. Limits your ability to define what you're deploying in your new environment on the new target. And if you're doing it at the hypervisor layer, you're tied into the hypervisor. So whether that's VMware, Hyper-V, whatever it is, you're tied into that. And again, it limits your choice, which can be cost expensive, but also at the same time, ultimately mean that you end up with a solution that doesn't solve all of your problems. It might not be the best fit for yourself. There's no ability to test with this. You could test, but you're effectively performing the migration twice. You've got no ability to bring up anything on the target side before the production environment is actually moved, other than by moving the production environment, which obviously at that point isn't testing. And again, I talk about this being expensive. Most of the expense around this is around lock-in. There's obviously a personnel involvement as well. If you're performing a storage vMotion, for the most part, you're going to have someone keeping an eye on that. For the exact reasons that I mentioned, if there's a failure, that needs to be reinitiated and restarted. In-guest agent solutions. So this is another one. Again, pros for this is it's moving the VMs as whole. It's treating each VM as an individual VM, and you can therefore manage the movement of those VMs at that level, which again means that you don't necessarily need to understand exactly what's configured within that VM. And it provides you greater control. And that's because it's doing ongoing replication in the background, which means that when you actually move, you've got more control for everything to arrive on that target side at the same time. As a con for this, I've actually got in-guest agent. As soon as you're installing anything in a VM, there's going to be a performance impact. You're monitoring I/O and forwarding it out on a per VM basis. Every single production VM that you're looking to move, therefore, is going to have an impact on it. You need to build target VMs in a lot of scenarios. So this isn't all in-guest agent solutions, but some of them you need to build the environment that you're replicating into on the target side. And again, as soon as you're doing that, it's very resource intensive. You're configuring everything on the target side before you can even set up the replication. And installing the in-guest agents on their own, it's great if you're talking tens of VMs, probably not too much of a challenge. When you're talking hundreds or thousands of VMs, the overhead of just getting the agent installed can be very intensive as well. With this as well, it does give you the ability to test, but when you're testing, quite a lot of the time is actually that ongoing replication stops. So then when you finish the testing, you're then in a position where you've got a large amount of data change that needs to be replicated over. And it's just what impact that has on your migration timescales, and it's something that's worth considering. So if we look at Zerto and how we manage these typical challenges, so we talked about knowledge, understanding your application, understanding the dependencies, how you manage that. Zerto has numerous solutions here. Number one is we provide our virtual protection groups. You probably all know what virtual protection groups are, but it allows you to group your VMs so that when you move them as one. Effectively, you can create a virtual protection group per application, allowing you to move all dependencies at the same time, so they all arrive on the target side at the exact same time. We also give you the ability to test failover. So before you do that migration, you can actually test the migration to validate, are all my settings correct? If you do have any scripting that performs configuration in your applications post-migration, you can test that. You can test the network element side of things. And the whole time you're testing, Zerto is still replicating in the background. So there is no at-risk testing here. So once you finish testing, there's no need to fire a load of data change over the wire because we've continuously been doing it. Technology lock-in. Hopefully you already all know Zerto is storage agnostic. We're becoming more and more hypervisor agnostic. We support VMware and Hyper-V today. And obviously, public, private, and hybrid cloud deployments are all supported by Zerto. So on that note, cloud adoption. You can move your workloads between all of these environments. Zerto performs that conversion on the fly as we're replicating. There's no manual involvement in that scenario. We can replicate in and out of these environments. And then on top of that as well, I guess if we're looking at what we support, it's AWS, Azure, IBM Cloud, and then obviously all of our CSP partners as well. So it's a fairly large footprint around the supported cloud platforms out there today. And this will be an ever-expanding list, undoubtedly. And then time constraints. As I said, this is the big one. Zerto gives you the ability to migrate the data in the background, and therefore it becomes a background task. We have bandwidth throttling in there, so you can actually limit the impact on your bandwidth during that period. I'll touch a bit more on the next slide about how we do that. I guess essential to everything we're doing here is the continuous data protection. Once you've moved that big data set, we then just continually update based on the changes that are occurring on the production side. So when you do come to move, it's not a large data move, and that ultimately minimizes any migration window that you're looking at. Cool. So if we look at actually what our migration process is, so as I said, the first process is initial replication. You can actually pre-seed with this, so you can ship a copy of the VM over to the target side, and then all we're doing is just replicating the changes that have occurred since you took that copy, or you can fire the entire data set over the wire. As I said, bandwidth throttling can be useful in this. It's a background task, and if you limit the amount of bandwidth that Zerto can utilize, it's going to limit the impact on your production environment. You can even limit the bandwidth on a time basis. So core business hours, it can be limited. Outside of business hours, it can run full throttle. But the key thing is, this doesn't necessarily need to be included in the actual migration window itself. You can do this months before the migration is going to happen, because afterwards, Zerto is then going to continually replicate. So we're just continually replicating the changes that occurred until you are ready to perform the migration. Key element here is putting the timeframes for that migration completely in your control. Yeah. So what the process is when you do initiate that migration is when you initiate a move, we'll shut down the VMs in the VPG on the source side. And then what we'll do is insert a checkpoint post-shutdown in the journal. And we insert that checkpoint in the journal post-shutdown so that there's zero data loss. Obviously, if you're doing a migration, it's a controlled procedure. Having an RPO of a few seconds behind production, you're not going to want to lose that seconds. And there's no need to lose the seconds of data there. So Zerto performs this function to ensure that there is zero data loss. You're recovering to a point in time where the VM was effectively shut down. And essentially, the data is already on the target side. So when we initiate this move, the VMs are literally added to the inventory of vCenter or whatever the target environment is on the target side. And then we boot them according to boot orders that you've configured. We'll add them to the networks that you've defined. We can re-IP each NIC individually if required. You can run pre- and post-recovery scripts, which can be automating elements around config changes potentially within your applications themselves. And that whole process is automated. So your whole migration runbook, which, as you can test beforehand to validate is it correct. You can have pre-configured, and it's just a few minutes to actually perform the move itself. So your migration windows go from being this large to just a few minutes with a resource overhead that is very small as well. We also, when you do this, give you the ability to, or rather an extra safety net. It gives you the ability to validate the migration. Have we moved successfully? Is that all of the applications come up successfully? And we call this our commit process. So when it fails over, what we haven't done in the background is committed the journal to the replica disk. So we haven't committed you to the point in time you've effectively migrated to, which is that zero RPO point in time, as I mentioned. It gives you the ability to validate, have we recovered successfully? Have we moved successfully? Once you've validated that, you can then commit it. We'll commit the journal to disk. Alternatively, if you realize there are some issues, maybe some configuration in one of your scripts that you're running as a post-recovery or something didn't work as expected, you can actually reverse the procedure. So you've got that rollback, it's an instant rollback. Any migration you do, there's always a plan to roll back, and with Zerto, that is a one-click option. I guess key thing just to emphasize, Zerto is hardware agnostic. We can do this as well from a hypervisor perspective and cloud perspective. We can go from VMware to Hyper-V, Hyper-V to VMware. I know Aaron's have got some stories around that, as well as obviously into the public clouds, IBM Cloud, AWS, Azure, and vice versa. And we can even replicate within those environments. So if we look at the use cases, as I said, private clouds, VMware to Hyper-V, CSP migrations. A lot of CSPs actually use Zerto to onboard their customers. It can speed up onboarding, it's massively useful to them. We then have obviously public cloud migrations. You are looking to get into public cloud environment, or vice versa, you're looking to get things back out. And then we do the intra-cloud migrations as well. So we can migrate between IBM Cloud and Azure and AWS. We can actually do within regions, or rather cross regions within Azure, which gives you a fair amount of flexibility as well. If you look at things like Brexit in the UK, there's a requirement that people are looking at, and how do we move our data sets back into the UK or out of the UK if you're an EU country. And so the requirement to be able to move data between regions, for example, in Azure is a useful requirement as well. And I guess the key thing that this provides is hybrid cloud mobility. Pretty much every customer we're talking to has some form of hybrid cloud strategy or is talking about hybrid cloud. But I guess historically, we're talking to customers who have implemented hybrid cloud strategies, and they've placed their workloads based on the day one requirement. But that requirement quite often does change, and no one really thinks about, well, actually, how do we move the workload down the line when that requirement does change? Maybe from a cost perspective, public cloud hasn't worked out for that particular application, and you want to move it back in-house on your on-prem environment. How do you manage that? Zerto is one of the only products out there today that allows you to provide a true hybrid cloud strategy where you can move your workloads around according to where they fit best. And this really touches on what Zeev was just covering in the keynote, and our new messaging around IT resilience and being an IT resilience platform. If you look back at 2011 with our first product release, we were very much focused on disaster recovery. The idea now is that we're an IT resilience platform. There's multiple use cases to Zerto, enabling hybrid cloud being one of them. Obviously, migration's a big use case. You've got the disaster recovery use case, and backup is something that's going to be coming in, although not in a traditional backup form. And you'll hear more about that tomorrow. So on that, I just want to hand over to Aaron so they can give you some insight on a real-life customer migration and how they did that. Cheers.
Thanks, Steve. Once again, my name is Tommy Meek, and I lead the technology infrastructure and support organization at Aaron's. And over the next few minutes, we'll talk through how Zerto made our data center migration project go seamless. And it was so seamless that the following Monday from the big move wave that we had planned back last fall, that our CIO and COO both asked, hey, how come you guys backed out and did perform the migration? And even I had to ask Michael myself, did we actually do it? But it was very seamless and went off without a hitch. Aaron's is a 63-year-old company based out of Atlanta, Georgia, and we are an omni-channel provider for lease-to-own solutions for furniture, appliances, and electronics. Roughly a $4 billion company with 1,700 plus stores spread across the US and Canada. And let me give you a glimpse into our data center footprint. When I first started about 4.5 years ago, the interview process was done a little bit differently. The CIO, instead of him taking me a tour, giving me a tour around the office, he let me give him a tour and kind of give him a glimpse into what I saw. So we walked through, of course, the developers, the DBAs, and what have you, the call center. And when we got to the data center, I said, well, this must be your lab. And I knew right then that was the wrong thing to say, because that was our production data center. So at that moment, I knew that we were going to have heating, cooling issues, and this will be the first summer in Atlanta that we won't have to worry about that. We're actually in a spot that it won't be an issue. As we grow our omni-channel business, the availability of the workloads were also a bigger need to be always on. And then lastly, we just wanted to get out of the data center business altogether. It's just something that we didn't succeed in, and we just didn't have the resources or the time to put into it. So we stepped back. We looked at a colo situation that they're going to help us make that transition to the hybrid cloud and grow our public cloud usage along the way, as well as help in our version of our digital transformation. So I'll hand it over now to Michael Cushman, who is our principal infrastructure engineer and led the data center project, and he'll have some good insight.
Wrong way. So this is just a high-level overview of what we accomplished. As Tommy mentioned, we moved from a single data center from Georgia up to New Jersey. We had over 100 applications. Put that in perspective, large portion of them are homegrown applications, so it kind of goes into what Steve was saying of problems with migrations. Those 100 workloads, though, they encompass roughly 1,000 VMs, so pretty large footprint. Of course, there's much bigger ones, but like Steve mentioned as well, we broke it up into multiple move waves. What we did first is we took dev and QA, and we were willing to take a risk with that just to kind of get a feel for the product and how things would go and learn from that. So we took dev and QA, and we just moved all of that in one weekend. That was roughly 400 to 500 workloads itself. So we learned a lot of good things there. Most of them were limitations with our own infrastructure, not actually the product. For example, bandwidth, latency, storage. I mean, Zerto will push and pull as quickly as you can let it go. So if you don't have the right controls, the right things on each end, you're going to run into some issues with that. And then obviously the speed that the product helped us move. We go into some of the other ways Steve had mentioned of the other ways you can do these things, and it really was never an option for us. We knew in the back of our head that we had those options, but no one really wanted to do that. I mean, who wants to do those things that require so much more time and energy and downtime? So it was really a no-brainer. And as Steve mentioned, we brought in a partner to help us with this. We had very little to no experience with moving a data center, so we wanted to bring someone in. We brought in our partner, Cumberland Group, that has done it many times. So we needed someone to kind of manage the project to help get us where we needed to be. So they came in, and we had this grand idea going in, right, that we're going to do some application dependency mapping. So it'll be easy. We'll just move one application at a time. Business will never know what happened. We start doing the dependency mapping, and just like a lot of companies, everything talks to everything. So there goes that idea, right? So kind of scrap that. We came up with a dev QA move wave, learned a lot from that. And then we started to just peel away at systems we could in production that didn't have those dependencies, or the latency between New Jersey and Georgia wasn't a big deal for performance of the way things operated. So we whittled it down as much as we could. I think our final production move wave that we did over the last weekend was somewhere in the 300 VM number there. And there was a couple systems that we actually didn't move with Zerto just because the workloads, the way they're architected, things of that nature. But we were able to, as Tommy mentioned, pretty much successfully pull it off with little to no impact to the business and people questioning whether it really happened. So it was huge for us to be able to do that. It was huge for us to have a partner guide us in that and get all the right people involved, all the right, architects, and developers, and everybody that knew. They help us stage things, right? Like load balancers, firewall rules, things of that nature that you want ready before you get to the destination. So you can literally click that button and have very few things to do once you get there. So obviously with that, using the product, reduced complexity big time. I think during one of our move waves, our CIO is actually sitting behind me, and I clicked move. He's like, "Wait, you just moved it?" I was like, "Yeah, that's it, man." And he's like, "You're kidding!" And it's just pretty funny that he saw it himself how easy it was. But obviously, so little time goes into the process of actually protecting things. Some of the complexities with the distance and storage. We've got. I mean, to speak to the storage agnostic thing, we probably had 10, 15 different brands of storage at our old data center, and the problem we ran into was we were trying to pull data so quick, and of course Zerto is going to go as quickly as you can, to where that was causing some problems. But so what we ended up doing was just slowly protecting things leading up to the migration. So we'd throw a few workloads in a VPG, then throw a few more the next week, a few more the next week, so that they were all protected. And then once you get them protected, the change rate is pretty minimal. Of course, the availability, no one knows anything's happening unless you kill the storage like I did at one point in time, then you have some problems. But no one really knows anything's going on. No one knows that you're syncing the data. No one knows that it's ready to cut over. And then, I would say we probably even had less than 30 minutes for some of our smallest migrations. Just some small things here and there that, low-hanging fruit that no one really used all the time, or that we could just do during the day. We tried to peel those off pretty much at any time that made sense. Keep going the wrong way. Yeah, so some of the lessons learned, obviously we did the phased approach. The dependency mapping, while it was a good exercise, didn't really give us too much benefit just because there were so many dependencies. But it was still a good practice so that we could still weed out some of the stuff that didn't fall into there. Number two is a big one for me personally. We've been talking about a data center migration for a few years leading up to when we actually did it. And just the thought of thinking of that, it's pretty overwhelming, right? There's a lot of moving pieces. How are we going to do this? How are we going to do that? How's the business going to react if we're down too long? So many questions come up that can come pretty stressful, overwhelming. And I wouldn't say it was easy, but things could have been a lot worse than they were had we gone with some of the other styles of migration. The POC was quite easy. We had a couple ideas going in, and then we brought our partner in, which there was really the best idea was Zerto, and then there was a couple others. But the POC, it was a no-brainer after we set up a couple VPGs, moved a few things. It was like, yeah, this is the way to go, no doubt. The time it takes to set it up, the time it takes to move it, great features that allowed us to be a little proactive was basically, we in the VPGs, we assigned all the IP addresses for the destination. So that allowed us to create all the firewall rules in advance, create all the load balancing rules, and everything, make DNS changes, things of that nature. So some of those features were very helpful for us. And obviously, everything I've said, it just made everything more simple. It's that easy. I guess hand it over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Michael. So does anyone have any questions on any of that? Cool.
My question's around creating the VPGs. Did you set those up by hand? Did you script to create those? What was your process to deploy that many VPGs?
Yeah, we did it more on a manual basis. Part of it was because of the complexities in our environment, right? Part of it was because we realized we were killing the source storage, so we couldn't just kind of do it in any special fashion other than let's put 10 VMs in there, let's let them get synced, and then when those are done, we'll put some more in there. So, we may have been able to utilize it, but just with our use case, there were so many different factors that kind of limited us in being able to do so.
But it is absolutely possible to script it. Zerto's API is completely open, and creating VPGs, things like that, they're all available. Vast majority of the capabilities in the GUI today are available, and those that aren't are going to be added very soon anyway. So we've got numerous partners who have integrated and scripted it. You heard Daniel talk about the integration that IBM resiliency services have today. They're obviously utilizing our APIs to do exactly that.
So with applications maybe that were homegrown or legacy, did you see anything you had hard-coded IP addresses that you had to address, and maybe they couldn't exist in the VLAN on both sides? Did you face that situation at all?
Yeah, that's where it helped in the planning phase, was part of that discovery, right? We're getting even people that weren't familiar with those applications, right? Someone's built an application, left the company, been gone for X amount of years. We were able to get people aware of the issue that can cause. And I wouldn't say we eliminated all of that, but a good portion of that was fixed prior to actually cutting over. So they would go in and fix those hard-coded IPs and things of that nature. But at the same time, I mean, we'd be lying if we said stuff didn't break. But we tried to do it in a fashion to where it was minimal business impact.
My next question, you said you moved 4 different workloads, I guess, over a 3-month time. When you were part of the way through each of those, and set A was talking to set B, or your data centers had to communicate, did you see performance issues, or did it impact your end users?
Yeah, a couple times we actually had to kind of create new move waves to compensate for that. We'd say, oh shoot, we forgot this database server is pretty important in the performance of this. So there were kind of ad hoc moves to alleviate that. With it being in a different state than our users now, I mean, we had to overcome some stuff where we have to rely a little more on terminal servers now, right? Because some of the applications the users were using were fast when you're in the same, couple milliseconds. But now that we're in New Jersey, we have to rely on terminal servers for that good performance. But yeah, other than that, not too much.
When we first started, the number of move waves was much larger than 4. But as we went along, we had the confidence that when we hit those performance issues, that we could just bundle it all together and make that, 3rd or 4th move wave bigger than we initially expected, and then just go.
One of the backs.
Great presentation, by the way, guys. Quick question. A lot of the stuff you guys talked about is about virtual. Did you have a physical aspect? Or?
Yeah, so actually, we had probably close to 200 workloads that were physical before we started the migration. But to simplify things, we actually virtualized them in the data center first, and then protected them with Zerto just to minimize that downtime. And then the good thing was as we migrated things, it freed up infrastructure at the old data center to be able to virtualize that stuff before moving it.
Gotcha. So this was all VMware then? You went P2V?
Oh, yeah, that is one thing I did leave out. We were mixed. We were Hyper-V and VMware at our source data center, and we're able to migrate over to VMware exclusively for those Hyper-V or VMware loads.
It's worth noting, guys, as well, Zeb's probably getting at this here, but those of you that didn't make the IBM session this morning, IBM Cloud Migration Factory and resiliency services potentially have the ability to help you with those mixed environments, so it's worth talking to them. They're out there on the customer walkthrough, so go over and talk to them if you have similar requirements to that. It's not a virtual only in that scenario.
How many VPGs did you end up finally coming down with your overall installation?
I didn't necessarily keep track, but it would have been quite a bit, just because we were trying to keep them small. We didn't necessarily do it in terms of, okay, this application consists of this web server, this app server, this DB server. I literally just went through the list and just threw some in this one, threw some in that one. There was not much strategy to it, like if we were using it for DR, where you'd want to group those logically. Funny thing is I think we've probably moved 10 to 20 Windows Server 2003 servers, which I don't even think are supported, but it worked anyway. So that was pretty neat to see as well.
What would you say your biggest challenge or maybe the biggest issue might have been networking-wise with the migration? Once again, you did this for a data center migration. You didn't do this for DR, right?
Right, yeah. Okay. So, I mean, it's all about the size of the pipe from point A to point B, right? So we would have some issues where it's fully consumed. So some migrations would take a little bit longer. We've got some processes that happen throughout the month for some internal processes that do some funky stuff with some data. So Zerto would see it as large changes, and they were. So they'd have to resync those. So it got to a point with that where those VPGs were killing all of our other ones from getting synced. So we said, look, we just need to make the decision to move these workloads now and kind of suffer for the last 2 weeks leading up to the last one. But yeah, I mean, obviously the bigger the pipe, the better. But you may run into other limitations with maybe your storage can't push out the data that fast or things of that nature. So it's kind of all pros and cons, right? There might be a trickle down effect of, well, I have this much pipe, but now I have these issues. So,
did you have any DNS errors? Obviously you're moving from different IP ranges to different IP ranges, or maybe you stretched your VLANs and they kept the same IP. How did you deal with that change on obviously the architecture level, and what did you have to do at the employee/user level in order to make sure that they realized those changes and were able to continue working?
Yeah, so there was a pretty big discovery just on DNS alone. If I'm not mistaken, we pretty much exported all of our DNS entries that resolved to the subnet, the old subnets, and kind of looked at first which ones were static, because those are the most important ones, obviously. And then with our IP assignments, we took the time to not only assign a new IP, but map it to the DNS entry. So we knew that those had to be updated at the time of cutover to try to reduce the impact. Because a lot of our users, it was meant to be not very noticeable for them. Same DNS names, all that stuff, just obviously in the back end pointing to the new system. So it was really in the preparation that helped on that big time.
Did you have to do like DNS flushes on their level in order to make sure that
So the good thing, yeah, we did it in off hours, so we just waited for standard replication time of the DNS. In some cases, one of the IT employees would try to verify their system or something like that post conversion, and of course they can't get to it. So that was the first thing. Well, flush your DNS and you should be good.
I think we're a little bit out of time, but I know that Tommy and Michael will be available to answer your questions after the session if you want to go up and talk to them, or if you want to catch them in the hallway somewhere. I just want to make sure that people have time to get to their next session. But thank you so much, Tommy and Michael, for sharing your experience using our solution for migrations, and thanks, Steve, for presenting on our solution as well.
Thanks, guys.